Our first lesson with Beowulf this week will be looking at some of the background that goes into the poem before I start talking about the poem itself. So I want to talk a little bit today about the language and where English kind of comes from. So language, whether it's English, French, German, Spanish, has always been a dynamic institution. So it's not something that just is set in stone forever. Those languages that are tend to be what we call dead languages, like Latin, ancient Greek, all of that. So when we look at the birth of the English language, it's not a simple task of saying, oh, English started right here. Instead, what we do is we have to go a little bit into the history, and what we'll look at are really four different waves that took place. The first wave we're going to look at has to deal with England, if you want to think of England, and this is a time before we had formal countries, formal nation states. Instead, what you had are these loose conglomerations of clans. And this was not just true in England, it was true throughout Europe, throughout most of Asia as well. These little tribal warlords maybe that popped up. And so if we look at England in particular, England's story is no different than a lot of places. But if we look, say, somewhere about 50,000 years before the Romans came in, okay? So Julius Caesar is going to mark that period where the Romans would come in. We had basically a series of tribes, people that were living in England. These were natives to the country, much like our Native Americans who inhabited North America. There were four principal groups. These groups were known as the Celts, the Brythons, the Picts, and the Scots. And really, only the Scots remain. But when we look at these others, we can kind of see how they're developing. The Brythons, certainly we get the name Britain from that. The Celts is a familiar name. We talk about the Celtic culture, okay? But these were four distinct tribes, each speaking their own dialect. The Celts were the first people about whose language we have some definitive evidence, where we have artifacts, we have examples of the language, and we have remnants of how these might have sounded by some of the languages that they give rise to, whether it's the Irish, okay, the Scotch, okay, or some of the other tongues that we kind of hear in and around spoken by the old people. Okay, so when we look at the Celtic language, we have very few words that remain, and this would be pre-English, maybe what we'd call it. Certainly there's some place names, but a lot of the English words that were part of this ancient English tongue are no longer in existence. Many of them would be unrecognizable to us. But certainly there's a small fragment that continued to maintain a basic level within our language. And these are some of the common words that we use all the time. The a and the he, the she, okay, it, they, and you see the list here going through there. So some very common words that are in there, along with some other ones that are less common, but you'll see maybe used more frequently in England than maybe America. So again, for some 50,000 years until the Romans came in, that was basically the language where these four tribes interacting with each other, making war with each other, sometimes intermarrying. And so you had this kind of language beginning to blend and beginning to form. Well, sometime around 55 BC, we have the first Roman incursions into England. And that first Roman, very famously, was Julius Caesar, who attempted but failed to conquer England. England was a very rough country. And if you think about those tribes, I mean, we had everything from the Picts, who would paint themselves blue and just scream like banshees before warfare, scaring a lot of the soldiers that they would fight against. And the Roman soldiers were not used to that kind of warfare. So Julius Caesar started to mount an attack in 55 BC and then pulled back. Later, it would be under Emperor Claudius, some dozen years later, who would finally conquer England for the Romans. And certainly we have instances where it wasn't an easy job. They conquered territories, but they were not able to conquer completely. You had outlying groups that would sometimes fight. One of them led by the warrior Boudica, who seems to have been a fairly successful rebellion against the Roman troops. By some accounts, she killed nearly 100,000, more conservatively about 70,000 Romans, and really caused them a lot of turmoil and pain. And her story is interesting. We'll hear that from one of the groups as they talk about her during their presentations. But because of that Roman influence, when Rome finally did manage to conquer large chunks of England, they brought with them their language, their customs, their culture. And certainly Latin became the dominant language. If you wanted to do business with the empire, you had to speak Latin. Although it should be noted that because these natives were not trained in speaking Latin, often what would happen is the Latin business owners would have to learn some kind of hybrid language, kind of like we talk or think today about like Tex-Mex or Spanglish. So as the Romans began to tame this wild country, they began to add cities, and they began to add their culture, they began to add an infrastructure. You saw Romans begin to marry with some of these natives here, so the population begins to grow. The language, too, begins to take root, and we see a blending of these things taking place. Another hugely important influence on the language developing, and why we're not exclusively kind of a Latin-speaking country, is you also saw Christianity making inroads into England, depending on which emperor was in charge and how he favored or did not favor Christianity. You saw these missionaries coming in who would begin to work with the tribes and also begin the process of writing and recording some of this mythology that they came across. So the Romans were in power from about, like we said, 43 BC until the Romans began to pull out. And so as that empire began to collapse, as it began to expand too far, almost like a giant balloon that got too far and too unmanageable for them, it began to consolidate its power back. And England was one of those outer regions that ultimately was abandoned. It didn't mean the Romans completely left. You still had people who considered themselves Romans. You still had people who spoke the language, spoke Latin. You still had governments kind of in place. But little by little, they began to pull back. And as they did, what you had take its place, as the Romans pulled out, okay, they began to retreat back into Rome and consolidate there to basically defend themselves against these outsiders, these German tribes, okay? And eventually Rome would move to Byzantium and Constantinople. But in England, that left that territory kind of ripe for the pickings. And so as the Romans pulled out, you saw these German tribes, okay, the Angles, the Saxons, the Utes, who began to move from Scandinavia, from Saxony, which would be northern Germany, and they began to invade in different waves and take over territories in there. Now, this is hugely important because what it meant was that these invaders were bringing another influence into the language that was being spoken. So as the Romans were pulling out and the Germanic tribes were moving in to fill that void, you saw the Latin mixing with the original languages that were there, okay, the Picts, the Scots, the Celts, the Brythons, along with the Latin, and then suddenly you had this German tongue mixing with it. So by about 410, the last of the Romans were leaving England, and certainly by 449, within almost 40 to 50 years, the Germanic tribes began taking over. Now, this is also, curiously, where we often find King Arthur, who's often misplaced as being in like the 1100s, 1200s with shining armor. King Arthur most likely was a clan leader who was left over, a remnant from this Roman Empire. And there's some stories about King Arthur actually traveling to Rome. Most likely he was some kind of Celtic chieftain sometime around 500 who was left to kind of defend the country, and he was able to consolidate a loose consolidation of some of these clan leaders to fight against the German hordes that were coming toward him. All right, so as the Germans came in, we had this mixture going on, and I want you to think of the language as following about a 500-year plan, okay? So we had, again, some 50,000 years of natives and then about 500 years of Roman rule. they would pull out, and we'd have close to 500 years of this Germanic rule, the Anglo-Saxons, okay, and those tribes, and that would be mixing this melting pot of a language. Now, what you got is the Latin would change from the soft sounds to a much more guttural and throaty sound. And so we're going to take a look at what that looks like, but you also had, you certainly had the Christian church still there, okay? And that Christian church was huge influence on the language because they were beginning to record these stories and trying to outreach. And so what you saw as missionaries, as they thought it might be easier, and it was easier to blend cultures rather than to try to force cultures upon people and risk your death. So what we get under people like Pope Gregory the Great, who was sending missionaries all the time to England, is you had this blending of taking this Norse mythology and blending it with the Latin and making some concessions. And so the Gregorian Calendar, famous for giving us our days of the week, were named after some of these Norse myths. So we have Moon Day, we have Twee's Day, okay, Woden's Day, Thor's Day, Frigga's Day, Saturn's Day, and Sontag's Day. Those would become the Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. All of these are Germanic gods. And so you'll see that influence certainly happens there. And we still see remnants of it, of course, in the language that we speak. So this would be known as Old English. And this is the language of our poem Beowulf. It would be recorded by an anonymous monk, okay, actually a couple of monks. It would be written down. It would be transcribed by future monks, put onto preserved manuscripts. Those would later be burned, and then we would be left with really 1 to 2 copies of Beowulf left standing. But I want to kind of go through, what does this sound like? I'm going to play this for you in another setting. But you see the language. This is a verse called Fader Ure, and the AE sound that you see, okay, is a flat A, as in the word hat. It's an A sound, okay. You'll also see some interesting letters that pop up. One looks like a P that's pronounced as a TH. You might see another one that looks like a D with a cross between a D and a T. That is also a TH sound, okay. And I also want to remind you that there's an old rhyme that I learned, and I don't think they still do it in elementary school. But when we learned the vowels A, E, I, O, and U, and then we learned and sometimes Y and W. Okay, so the Y can serve as a vowel sound in a word like sky. Okay, it tends to have an I sound. All right. The W is interesting because the double U is actually a double U. We very rarely see that except in a word like vacuum. Okay. But that W would go from vowel sounds into its own consonant sound as a W. And so when we look at this, we'll see that kind of interspersed in this writing here. But Fader Ure du the Ert onheffenem si then Name gehalgeld, to bekume din rike, gerutha then willa on earthen sway on heffenum, erne gewara wallekan leif sail us to dag, and forgive us ure giltas, sway we forgeffath urum getilden, and ne glad du us on kostnunga, ac alice us of ifele solixe. So, does not sound like English, but this would be English in its early stages. Now, this is almost unrecognizable for us. Maybe we recognize a word or two. Certainly the and, again, we said that was part of the Old English, so those are certainly recognized. And on, okay, but this is unrecognizable. So we'll get to what this is in just a moment. But if we look a little further at what's happening, the next stage would be French. And sometimes, so remember, we had the Norman conquest. I'm sorry, we had the influence of the German tribes sometime around 449, okay, A.D. Okay, and then in 1066, again about a 500-year difference, we have England invaded yet one more time. This time by the French under a guy named William the Conqueror. All right, who wound up fighting an English king named Harold. All right, and William, it's a long battle. It's an interesting battle. We could go through it, maybe save that for another time. But basically, what happened is the French won, and like the Romans before them and the Germans before them, this fourth wave began to mix their language, the French. They demanded that French be spoken. It blended with the Latin, with the German, with the original, until what you had was something that was very unique. Okay, it would become Middle English, and then let's take a look at what that looks like. This is the same. I want you to compare this. Let's move it up here. These two verses are the same, fader ure and ure fader. Now, I will tell you this, these languages all have a similar root, okay? It's called the Indo-European language root. And so we have a word like father in English, okay, which is padre in Spanish, pater in Latin, okay, fader in Old English, and fadir in the French. So what the French does is it softens things. It takes that guttural, harsh sound and it kind of evens it out. So this should be a little more readable. Ure fara, that art in heavens, hallowed be thy name. Thy realm or kingdom come to be. Be thy will done in earth as done in heaven. So you are beginning to see what would be called popularly the Lord's Prayer. Okay? And this is in Middle English. We begin to recognize now the language that we spoke. And then in another 500 years, what we're going to get is Shakespeare coming in and giving the tongue what we would call its modern edge. Okay? And so along in the 1600s, all right, along with other writers in the Enlightenment at the time, they would take this and standardize it. And so what we get is kind of an interesting blend of languages. So just to kind of close up here, this is an interesting story of how the language developed into the English that we speak now.